Good afternoon, one and all. Here we are heading to session 4 of the international webinar on women and development. The duty assigned to me is to welcome the session on behalf of the department. First of all, I'd like to welcome Sidharth R, second MA student of Department of Economics, University of Kerala, as the moderator of the current session. Now, I extend my hearty welcome to the first speakers, Bincy George, Rishi Kumar, and Sudatta Banerjee of BITS, presenting the paper Women's Vulnerability and its Associates During Floods, a study from Wayanad district of Kerala, India. Next, I'd like to welcome the speakers Anjana NC and Athira VP of University of Kerala, presenting the paper COVID-19 Pandemic and Women Labour Force Participation in India, Problems, Prospects and Challenges. I'd also like to welcome Reshma Emma, second MA Economics student of the department, for delivering the vote of thanks. Also, I welcome each and every participant to this session. Now, let me invite the moderator for initiating the session.
Thank you, Abhirami. Now we move on to the session. This section actually, this is the fourth session of the international 3-day international seminar on women and development. And this fourth session deals with two important natural disasters and their impact on gender and specific to women and the area of women and development. The first paper is by Bincy George, Rishi Kumar, and Sudatta Banerjee, all of them from Birla Institute of Technology and Sciences, Hyderabad campus. And the second paper is by Anjana NC and Athira VP, both MPhil scholars of University of Kerala. Their paper is on the COVID pandemic and the impact on women labor force. And the first paper is on women's vulnerability and its associates during floods, a study specific to the area in the district of Wayanad in Kerala. So I invite Bincy George from BITS to initiate their first presentation.
Hello everyone, I am Bincy George and I am a PhD student at BITS Pilani Hyderabad campus. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my paper in the fourth international webinar on women and development. My topic for today is women's vulnerability and its associates during floods, a study from Wayanad district of Kerala, India. This is the paper with my supervisors, Dr. Rishi Kumar and Dr. Sudatta Banerjee. So this is the overview of my presentation. We know around the world, everyone is affected by the disaster caused by climate change in one way or another. Especially when it comes to women, it's very important. And to achieve the fifth sustainable development goal, gender equality, climate change induced vulnerability among women should also be considered. So is climate change a major concern? Yes, climate change has become a major concern in recent years across the globe. Climate change has enhanced the occurrence and strength of severe rainfall and flooding. Such events will eventually lead to increased vulnerability of individuals, communities, and regions around the world. Based on a climate model, by 2050, around 920 to 3,400 million people worldwide will be exposed to an increased number of natural hazards owing to the greenhouse gas emission scenario. It is also estimated that around 100 to 580 million people will be exposed to the highest rank of river risk, flood risk by 2050. So climate change induced disasters over the time has resulted in increased gender inequality, especially worsening the condition of women when they are not able to maintain their livelihood practices due to inadequate capital assets. The reaction to climate change can be different for both men and women due to their different roles in society. Based on the Global Climate Risk Index 2021, developed by the organization German Watch, India ranked 7 out of 10 in terms of the most affected countries in 2019. Kerala, the southern state of India, witnessed devastating floods during the monsoon season of 2018 and 2019. This 2019 flood is an example of how global warming has affected this region, leading to intense rainfall, causing a greater threat to the vulnerable Western Ghats area. From the scientific studies, it is confirmed that this 2019 flood was an event of mesoscale cloudburst, never reported before in Kerala, which usually occurs in the northern parts of India. Such events due to the global warming can be a recurrent event in the southern state of India. Next, we will move on to the important literature related to this study that leads to the objective of this study actually. So first aspect is disaster and vulnerability. So the differential access to resources caused by the economic, social, geographical, demographic, cultural, institutional governance, and environmental factors causes vulnerability. In times of disasters, everyone in that particular region bears the negative consequences, though all are not affected in the same way. Some groups will be more vulnerable to disasters due to the social and economic inequalities existing in the particular region. Next aspect is climate change, disasters, and women. During a disaster, women are more vulnerable, and this vulnerability comes from the disaster itself and also from the position of women in society. Women earn less than men and works in a small home-based business or informal sectors. In such situations, the loss of livelihood aggravates their situation. Women are victimized often during a disaster in the particular aspect of vulnerability compared to men owing to the conventional practices and work-related practices. Due to their inferior position in society, often women exhibit less power to face natural disasters. Then adaptation to disaster. The adaptive capacity for men and women is determined by access to different capital assets and livelihood practices. Based on various studies, it is evident that households plan to adapt to flood and other climate-related disasters are guided by institutional and socio-economic factors, that is age, education, land access, size of the household, and credit obtained. So the main objective is to understand women's vulnerability to the extreme weather event of floods and identify its associates. Data and methodology. The study was carried out in the Wayanad district of Kerala, India. We surveyed 114 women from the Purdana village. So for this, many studies related to disaster and vulnerability analysis have interviewed the heads of the household for analyzing the effect and adaptation related to disasters caused by climate change. The study differs in this very aspect as it focuses on women exclusively, and such studies are very few. We created the Vulnerability Index for Women based on the modified Household Vulnerability Index framework of Tendai used by Nas and Zaki. The Vulnerability Index consists of 5 dimensions: human capital, natural capital, physical capital, social capital, and financial capital. We have checked the internal consistency reliability using the C alpha and the value is 0.73. These are the variables we have used to create each dimension of our vulnerability index. In the human capital dimension includes education and the skill of whether they know the swimming, and physical capital includes whether they have availed shelter, entry of flood water, land affected by flood. And social capital includes relief material received and warning received on time. Natural capital includes access to agricultural or homestead land. Financial capital includes land ownership, possession of livestock, whether they have savings, and own vehicles. The variables used in each dimensions are based on the NASA and Zaki, and some changes are made based on our data. The questions related to each dimensions were assigned codes, and we added up all the dimensions, create an index. The vulnerability index varies from 6 to 20. To find out the association between gender vulnerability with selected socioeconomic indicators, 3 statistical tests have been used. To start with, we use chi-square test in order to establish a linear relationship. Secondly, to measure the level of association between variables, Kramer's we have been used, and Fisher's exact test is also employed. Then we have estimated an ordinal logistic regression model. Since our outcome variable vulnerability index is ordinal, we have categorized the index into low, medium, and high vulnerable groups. So the associates are age, credit obtained, marital status, access to TV or internet, sex of the household head, types of family, whether they have received any government assistance during flood, women's monthly income, and religion. So for the study, we have used the following equation. We have also tested for the parallel line assumptions. Next, we will move on to the result and discussion section. In the first part, we discussed the result of the 3 statistical tests used to find out the association between vulnerability index and some selected socio-economic indicators. In the second part, we discussed the result of ordered logistic regression. So first is the association between age of the respondents and vulnerability. Here we get insignificant result from the statistical test, but at the same time from the table, we can see that most of the respondents in the age group 18 to 30 falls in highly vulnerable group compared to others. Next is the association between credit obtained by the respondents and their vulnerability. Here we have got significant association between vulnerability and availing credit. This result signifies the importance of credit availability for women. When they have access to credit, they can cope with disaster, as this helps them to create new income opportunities and subsequently reduce their vulnerability during disaster. This is evident from the table, which shows that 71% of the respondents who have not received any credit are highly vulnerable to disaster, while those who have access to credit are in less vulnerable category. Next is the association between vulnerability and sex of the household head. Here the association turns out to be insignificant. Even if the result turned out to be insignificant, we can see that women belonging to the male-headed households are more vulnerable to disaster than those women belonging to the female-headed households. Next is the association between religion and vulnerability. Here, the association between religion and vulnerability shows a significant results. Next is the association between women's income and their vulnerability. Here, this turns out to be significant as shown in the table. The result shows that availability of income reduces women's vulnerability during disaster. Women who face high vulnerability during disaster is those who without any income, but women who are getting some kind of income, they become less vulnerable during climate change disasters. Next is the association between vulnerability and government assistance they got during flood. Here, association between this government assistance and vulnerability turns out to be insignificant. Here we can see that most of the women who are highly vulnerable to disaster have got assistance from the government in terms of cash at the time of disaster after the damages have been assessed, while some are being left out without any assistance. Next, we will move on to the results of the ordered logistic regression. Here we can see that the variables credit obtained, access to TV or internet, and income are significant. We can see that women who obtained credit will be in a less vulnerable category because access to credit enables them to look for alternate income choices when their income source have been destroyed. In this aspect, our findings are in accordance with the many other studies related to vulnerability, which indicates that as women face restrictions in taking up several income generating activities due to the unavailability of credit in developing countries, women are vulnerable to natural calamities. Also, in the same way, those who have access to TV or internet also comes in a less vulnerable category in a sense that they can prepare for the disaster. When women have access to these information tools, they will get some prior information or warnings in times of disaster, which will help them to be prepared. Also, with the increase in income, we would expect an increase in the log odds of being in a less vulnerable category, given all other variables in the model are held constant. When women have income, that means they have the capacity or ability to cope with disaster. As indicated in studies, the access to resources, especially income and credit, will help women to cope with climate change disasters. So we will move on to the conclusion. The paper has attempted to identify the socio-economic associates of vulnerability among women during flood, which can also guide policy making in this area. That is, access to financial assets and information tools helps women to be prepared to cope when sudden disaster strikes. The lack of resources and inadequate access to information tools forces women to be vulnerable during disaster. Further, the information campaigns targeting women exclusively can also be an effective means to reduce women's vulnerability to these events. The efforts to improve the income sources of women can also contribute. So, majority of female respondents reported their income is coming from livestock and paid labor, and during the flood, due to loss of livestock, their income source have been severely affected. Therefore, while analyzing the vulnerability, we should also focus our attention to access to capital assets and resources available to women, which will enable them to cope with disaster. And there are some limitations in this study, that there are presence of recall errors. In some cases, the respondents were unwilling to reveal the information, and we cannot generalize the findings of this study as the study is limited to a particular area and different societies have different social settings, which influences women's vulnerability during disaster. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Very well structured and very good presentation, Vishwavitri. Now I invite Anjana and C to present the paper, COVID-19 Pandemic and Women Labor Force Participation in India, Problems, Prospects and Challenges.
First of all, I would like to thank the authorities for giving me an opportunity to present our paper on the topic COVID-19 pandemic and women labor force participation in India, problem, prospects, and challenges. Let us begin the presentation with a famous quote of Elizabeth Blackwell. She is the first woman in America to receive medical degree and who encouraged the women to participate in medical profession. Quote, if society will not admit of women's free development, then society must be remedied. Unquote. So let's move to the presentation. I introduce my topic. So as we know that the pandemic is always hit the people that bring changes in economic and social structure. Every pandemic has resulted in recession, unemployment, poverty, and killed thousands of lives. The COVID-19 virus, which the World Health Organization labeled a pandemic in 2020, has posed clear problems to the worldwide public health system. Yes, the pandemic has considerably enhanced uneven character of development for women who have been marginalized in most regions of developing world during the period of globalization. As we know that COVID-19 pandemic is also an unprecedented tragedy in human history, and it killed more than 3.7 million people and brought the world into an economic upheaval due to the pandemic induced lockdowns, and global economies are in the greatest slump since the Great Depression. What are the problems faced by women during the pandemic era? Women are facing a lot of issues during the pandemic. So, increase in unpaid caretaking at home due to the lockdown, reduction in employment due to the practice of social distancing in work sites, increase the level of gender-based violences, and higher physical mental stress because of the take care of children due to the closure of schools, and high risk because of work at home based stress and unequal access of the technology during the lockdown. As we know that there is a substantial evidence that social and economic repercussions of infectious illness epidemics are more detrimental to women than men. They endure a bigger share of home and care obligations such as school closures and caring for sick and elderly relatives, and they are also more vulnerable to domestic abuse. The pandemic has skewed India's already low female work participation even more, with female workers still experiencing high double-digit unemployment rates and female labor force participation rate significantly below the pre-pandemic levels. And what is labor force participation rate? We know that it is the percentage of people in workforce in the population. In that sense, female labor force participation rate is defined as the a percentage of women in the labor force in the population. So these are the important literature that I reviewed for my study. So what is the significance of the study? Yes, the female labor workforce participation rate is a key indication of women's economic empowerment as well as their agency at home and the workplace. Despite economic development, declining in fertility rates and improving education level for women and girls, India's female workforce participation rates remain low. On the other hand, there is a high frequency of women unpaid work and increased time of poverty, therefore a significant reduction in leisure time and loss of choice over how to allocate women's time among various activities, underscoring the non-remunerative and unrecognized character of women employment. Women's engagement in labor varies greatly across rural and urban areas as well as between states. During the pandemic situation became worse, the women labor force participation in employment sectors showing a declining trend, and gender disparity in work is a major moral and social concern, as well as a significant economic burden. In this framework, in this context, it is necessary to study women's representations of employment sector in India. So, to study the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the economic gender gap and to understand trends in female labor force participation in India during the pandemic era, these are the two objectives of this study. And to reviewing the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on economic gender gap, I analyzed global gender gap by World Economic Forum. And to understand the trends in female labor force participation rate, I reviewed or analyzed the female labor force participation and the participation rate published by Periodic Labor Force Survey by NSSO and MO, Ministry of Statistical and Program Implementation. The study have qualitative features of concern linked to female employees' working condition during the pandemic scenario in India. The present study is designed as a descriptive one. The necessary data has collected from secondary sources such as various NSSO reports, report of international labor organizations, periodic labor force survey by Ministry of Statistical and Program Implementation, Gender Gap Index published by World Economic Forum, and data from various published resources and journals. The used variables are meaningfully correlated to infer the findings by using percentages. The description method is using empirical studies and tabular and graphical representation. COVID-19 and economic gender gap. As we know that the gender gap is the difference between women and men as reflected in social, political, intellectual, cultural, or economic attainments or attitudes. Global Gender Gap Index aims to measure this gap in 4 key areas: the economic participation, educational achievement, health and survival, political empowerment. These are the 4 indicators or 4 areas that Global Gender Gap Index aims to measure on the gender gap on the basis of 4 indicators. So this is the situation or condition of India, that India is lag behind all other nations. According to World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index of 2021, India's ranked 140th out of the 156 nations in terms of providing equal chances to men and women often lack access to the healthcare and education that men do. In the world, India has one of the most unequal gender divisions of home labor. Due to the shift in the male allocation of hours, the gender differences in average hours spent on domestic work hours decreased in the first month of lockout, both nationally and across the most states. This is a table that shows South Asian gender gap ranking. So when considering the South Asian nations, India ranked sixth. India ranked in sixth position. The score is 0.626. So other nations, when Bangladesh, other countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives. So India is lag behind all these countries. Yes, when we considering the 8 South Asian nations, Bangladesh is the best performing country in the region, has narrowed the gender gap by 71.9% thus far. India is in the 6th position out of 8 South Asian nations as neighbor countries. As shows the worst performance in the gender gap index of 2021. According to the report, India's gender gap has widened from nearly 66.8% close to the year ago to 62 point percentage in this year, with only 22.3% of Indian women and 38.4% of Bangladeshi women participating in the labor market. Yes, women's labor force participation rate in the regions are on average of 51% of male labor force participation rates. This is the employed population by sex and region, persons aged 50 and under older 2019 and 21. This representation is based on the report of Sustainable Development Report of UN Women. So gendered effect on labor market are undeniable as nations recover from the epidemic. Women who were already underrepresented in employment and the labor market lost more jobs than males between 2019 and 2020. Globally, women employment has declined by 4.2%, while men's employment fell by 3%. In 2020, the number of employed women will have decreased by 54 million and 45 million women would have departed the labor market entirely. Even though women's predicted employment growth rate in 2021 is greater than men's, it will not be enough to restore women employment level back to the pre-pandemic levels. Let's analyze the trends in female labor force participation rate in India. So the reduction in the disparity between male and female labor force participation rate is a countering factor that will win out in the long run. The difference between male and female labor force has widened during last 70 years. This is the graphical representation of this labor force participation from 1993 to 1993-94 to 2017-18. The female labor force participation from 1983 to 1994-93, there was a little increase in labor force participation compared to male, and the female to male. So there is a higher disparity in labor force participation rate. So this is the recent data, trends in labor force participation rate during the pandemic era. So as we know that according to the recent periodic labor force survey, this is a quarterly periodic labor force survey in 2020. So there is a wide gap between male and female labor force participation rate. Women in India drive out the labor market sharply. So the major findings of this paper is that India has dropped 28 positions to 140th out 156 countries according to the survey. According to the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Survey, several reasons have to contribute to India's dismal performance in the World Economic Forum report. Some of the factors include a skewed distribution of resources and opportunities between men and women, as well as lagging female to male literacy. As evidenced by NSO study, Household Social Consumption, Education in India, which was conducted as part of the 74th round of the National Sample Survey. According to the survey, India's female literacy rate is 70.3%, while male literacy is at 84.7%. Women labor force participation has decreased from 24.8% to 22.3%. According to World Economic Forum report 2021, the culturally established preferences for the male child have led to increased discrimination against women. The reduction in the disparities between male and female labor force participation rate is countering factor that will win out the long run. The difference between the male and female labor force participation has widened during the last 17 years. As we already discussed the periodic labor force survey and female labor force participation during 2017-18. So there is a drastic or sharp decrease in female labor force participation. So this was regarded as the result of demonetization, which was thought to have curtailed the scale of economic activity. Those who believe in the positive features of corruption and black money are especially likely to think so. And the quarterly data on to April to June 2019-20, the labor market revealed that a big decrease in the female labor force participation rate and substantial increases in the unemployment rate following the epidemic and lockdown. Despite this, workforce participation yearly average statistic increased significantly in 2019-20 compared to the previous two rounds of periodic labor force survey estimates, and the average unemployment rate fell by 1% point from 5.8% to 4.8% in 2019-20. So we can conclude my findings that the female labor force participation rate has been declining during the pandemic period, showing the growing gender disparity in work and employment. If we are unable to maintain the more female employees in the labor market, the spike in female labor force participation or female participation might revert to low and decreasing rates. Some of the suggestions and recommendations for my study is that women's engagement should be encouraged and enabled by policy frameworks that are conscious of the gender-specific constraints that most women encounter. Gender-responsive policy must be established in this context. Policy makers in India and throughout the region should take a holistic approach to improving women's labor market outcomes by increasing the access to relevance of education and training programs, skill development, child care access, maternity protection, and provision of safe and accessible transportation, as well as encouraging a growth pattern that creates job opportunities, and provide better training and career counseling and improved work-family support. And another suggestion is that raising minimum wage is an essential public policy for women. Women must have better access to well-paid occupations that are currently predominantly performed by women when when economy is built following the COVID-19 pandemic. Investing in public sector infrastructure would not only increase the salary and economic security of individuals in such professions, but it will also make it simpler for those with full-time jobs to fully engage in the labor force and to be financial secure. Beyond the traditional labor force participation, numbers, policymakers should be more concerned with whether women can access better employment, establish uh, business, and take advantage of new labor market possibilities as a nation evolves. So let's conclude. The economic catastrophe brought by the discovery of new coronavirus is not like other recessions. Lack of access to the quality of childcare and in-person schooling option has lowered parental supply of labor, while demand for workers in high contact and inflexible service sector has decreased. Women, who are normally more affected by recession than males, have seen a significant and sustained reduction in employment and labor force participation as a result of this. To lower India's greater gender imbalance, legislative effort to empower women and stricter enforcement of the current ones are needed at a macro level. And women's empowerment, economic empowerment, empowers them to have control over their resources, possessions, and income. It also improves women's well being and their capacity to handle risk. It may lead to strategies to assist trivialized genders in a certain political and social environment. This is all about my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjana. This was also an enlightening presentation. Now I'm opening up the floor for questions from the audience.
Yes,
Please.
my name is Manekha. I'm pursuing MPhil Sociology, Department of Sociology, Karyavattam campus. So my question is to Anjana. Okay, you already said that the female labor force participation rate is declining during the pandemic period. So according to you, what are the reasons for this fall in women labor force in India during pandemic?
Yes, I already said that. The women labor force participation rate is declining sharply during the pandemic. Yes, there are a lot of reasons for that. Mainly, as we know that when the pandemic, due to the lockdown, there is increases the unpaid caretaking work at home due to the lockdown, and uh, women are compelled to uh, take care of their children due to the closure of schools. So this is one of the reasons, and for women are lag behind the female workforce participation. And another thing is that there is high risk to travel to the workforce, because as when we considering women, it's impossible to travel to one place to another for work. So the practice of social distancing, one of the reason, practice of social distancing also is one of the reason to reduction in the employment of female employment in the working sites. These are the reasons for, according to me, in this reduction of female labor force participation during the pandemic. Is it okay, Anaka?
Yes, okay. Thank you, Anjana. It's well presentation.
Question for Anjana. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible. Please continue.
Yeah, I have a question for Anjana. Anjana, the report, the annual PLFS report for the period 2017-18 and for the period 2019-20, there has been an increase in the female labor force participation rate. If you look at the PLFS reports, the PLFS 2 and the PLFS 3 reports, there has been an increase in the pandemic period in the female participation rate, especially in rural areas. So have you have you looked at the annual PLFS report?
Yes, please repeat the question once.
Yeah, I'm saying that if you look at the there have been 3 PLFS periodic labor force survey rounds so far, right? So the latest one was released in 2019-20 for this period was released this year. So if you look at the annual PLFS reports, there has actually been an increase in the female labor force participation rates, especially in rural areas. There has been a very sharp increase in female participation rates in the last 2 years. So I think you should look at that first of all. And secondly, I think you looked at the quarterly labor force participation rates, right? Hello?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, you looked at the quarterly PLFS. So you've looked at the quarterly and you've picked it from the periodic labor force survey reports, right? The bulletin, the quarterly bulletin.
I analyzed periodic labor force survey to the quarterly period labor force survey in urban areas.
Okay.
Yes, when we
so you picked it from the quarterly bulletin, right? The quarterly bulletin that is published, the periodic labor force survey quarterly bulletin. Because there is an annual report of PLFS, periodic labor force survey, that comes along with the data, and then there are the quarterly bulletins that are published subsequently, right? That the NSS people publish subsequently. So I'm just asking, where did you put the where did you take the quarterly data from? The quarterly participation rate data.
It's from Ministry of Statistical and Program Implementation. Periodic labor force survey for quarterly in urban areas.
In urban areas, yeah. So that is what I was looking at, because it is only for urban areas. So there might be, whatever your analysis is, I think it sticks better with the urban areas, because in rural areas, if you look at the participation trends, there has actually been a very sharp increase in rural areas where women participation is concerned, especially in agriculture. Because a lot of people went back home. There was a very mass exodus of workers. A lot of people went back home during that period, and a lot of women had to participate in agriculture in that period. So if you look at that, you'll find a very different participation trend. So I think I'll suggest you to look at that as well, the annual report as well, along with the quarterly. Quarterly is only for urban. So whatever your findings are, I think they're more relevant to the urban participation trends for women. So I'll suggest you to check that out as well once. That's all. Are you getting my point? Right?
I didn't get the rural. Yes, I got it. I get only
for your quarter,
urban female labor force participation data. Yes, okay. Thank you for the information.
Just check that once, because quarterly is only for urban areas, because you can only create a panel for urban areas in PLFS. Rural ke liye it is only the annual survey. Annual report is relevant. Only annual report you'll get the rural ka data.
I would like to post a question to Anjana. In the paper, you mentioned about the labor force participation rate of 2017-18. The decline is believed to be part of the demonetization. And you have added a sentence that those who believe in the positive features of corruption and black money are especially they would think like that. Why is that sentence there? Like, is the fall in labor force participation rate actually due to the economic shock that was part of the demonetization, or due to the fall in corruption or black money that is believed to have happened after demonetization? Now, I'd like to pass my comments. The first paper was well detailed and well structured and well presented. Congratulations to Bincy George, Rishi Kumar, and Sudatta Banerjee. Especially the construction of vulnerability index with respect to all the 5 dimensions: human capital, national capital, social capital, financial capital, and fiscal capital was very interesting and very interesting. And the results and findings are also very convincing. Congratulations. And the second paper has also similar findings and suggestions. Both of the papers actually, both the papers are based on natural disasters and their impact on gender workforce and women's inclusion into the economy. So both the findings are almost similar. Both the results are showing skewed distribution of resources and opportunities more towards men. And congratulations to both the presenters. So I think we can wind up the session if there are no more questions. Anybody wants to ask any more questions? I think nobody has asked any questions to the first presenter. Anybody?
Since there is no question and all, just yeah.
Okay, so I think we can conclude the session. I wholeheartedly thank all the participants for maintaining decorum and etiquette of the presentation, and especially the presenters of both the papers, and also the authors of the papers who were not present. And I thank Dr. Siddik Rabiyath and the organizing committee of the 4th International Seminar on Women and Development for giving me this opportunity of being the moderator. Thank you.
Good evening, one and all. I am extremely delighted to be a part of this webinar on one of the most relevant subject, women and development. Here my duty is to deliver the vote of thanks. First of all, I would like to thank Abhirami for the welcome speech. Next, I would like to thank Sidharth to be the moderator of the session, who wonderfully carried out it. Thank you, Sidharth. Honorably, I would like to thank the speakers, firstly, Bincy George, Dr. Rishi Kumar, and Dr. Sudatta Banerjee from BITS, on for presenting the paper on the topic, Women's Vulnerability and its Association During Floods, a study from Wayanad district of Kerala, India. Thank you all for your informative and great presentation on this paper. And also I would like to thank Anjana NC and Athira VP from University of Kerala on the topic COVID-19 pandemic and women labor force participation in India, problems, prospects and challenges. Thank you so much for your wonderful and great presentation on this paper. Finally, I would like to thank the department faculties, participants, audience, and my dear friends. We thank everyone for being with us. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you all. We had successfully completed all the 4 sessions today, and it was indeed a great day having a diverse topic being discussed, and young scholars in fact had come up with excellent papers as well as observations regarding the women's vulnerability, women's marginality, and other aspect of women in development. So thank you all. I'm looking forward tomorrow also to your active participation. We will meet tomorrow by 9:30 itself. With this, let me conclude the session and formally concluding today's session, and we will start the program tomorrow at 9:30 itself. Thank you once again.